In a small town, a young student sits at a wooden desk, pencil in hand, staring at a list of possible careers. The list is long: doctor, teacher, artist, engineer. The student feels a weight in the chest, a sense that each choice carries a promise and a loss. The student wonders if any path can truly reflect who they are, or if the world simply forces a decision. This simple scene mirrors a deeper question that has haunted thinkers for centuries. How does one find meaning in a world that does not hand out clear answers? A few hundred years earlier, a Danish pastor named Søren Kierkegaard walked the streets of Copenhagen with a notebook full of questions. He watched people go about their lives, obeying customs, following church teachings, and accepting roles handed down by family. Yet he sensed that many lived as if they were actors following a script, never asking why the script existed. He wrote, "Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards." In his mind, the student's hesitation was not just a personal worry, but a sign of a larger human condition. Kierkegaard's own life offered a vivid illustration. He fell in love with a woman named Regine Olsen, a bright and lively student. He proposed marriage, but then withdrew, believing that his own inner turmoil would ruin any shared life. He wrote letters to her explaining that his sickness of the spirit made a marriage impossible. The broken engagement left both of them in pain, yet it also gave Kierkegaard the raw material for his ideas about choice, responsibility, and the anxiety that follows a free decision. He called this anxiety the dizziness of freedom, a feeling that comes when a person stands before many possible paths and must pick one. Across the Alps, a German philosopher named Friedrich Nietzsche trekked through the Alps, feeling the wind whip his face and the cold bite his skin. One stormy night, a sudden thunderclap seemed to echo his own inner turmoil. Nietzsche's hearing began to fail, a loss that would grow into total deafness. He wrote, "When one has once made a decision, it is as if the world itself has turned into a new shape." The storm and his hearing loss both forced him to confront the fact that the world does not give comfort. It only presents raw conditions that a person must meet with their own strength. Both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche lived before the word existentialism was used. Yet their writings planted the early seeds of what later thinkers would call existential thought. They asked, what does it mean to be a person who must create meaning in a world that offers none? How does one act when there is no universal rule that tells you what to do? Their work focused on the individual, on personal choice, and on the feeling that comes when one faces the unknown. The traveller in the story is another example. Imagine a lone wanderer on a road that suddenly turns dark as clouds gather. The traveller can keep walking, hoping the storm will pass, or can seek shelter, risking the loss of the journey's purpose. The traveller feels a mix of fear and excitement, a sense that each step now carries weight. The storm is like the anxiety that later sections will call existential anxiety, the uneasy feeling that comes when freedom meets uncertainty. The traveller's decision, like the student's, shows how each person must act in the face of a world that does not promise safety. Kierkegaard's writings on the leap of faith explain how a person can move forward even when reason offers no clear answer. He said, "Objectivity is truth." In plain words, he meant that what matters most is how a person feels and decides, not what others think is true. This idea links directly to the student's dilemma. The choice of career is not only about market demand or parental expectations, but about what the student feels inside. It also links to the traveller's storm. The decision to seek shelter or press on depends on the traveller's own sense of purpose. Nietzsche, on the other hand, warned against what he called the herd. He saw most people as following the crowd, accepting values handed down without question. He wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." This short line tells us that if a person finds a personal purpose, they can survive any hardship, even a storm or a deafening silence. Nietzsche's loss of hearing forced him to listen to his own inner voice because external sounds faded. He turned his suffering into a source of strength, showing that personal pain can become a catalyst for new ideas. These early ideas did not appear fully formed. They were scattered notes, passionate letters, and poems that later scholars would gather into a larger picture. Yet they already contained the core of existential thought. The focus on personal freedom, the weight of choice, and the anxiety that follows. Later sections of the video will explore how these themes grow into discussions of freedom and anxiety, showing how the student's career choice and the traveler's storm become symbols of larger philosophical questions. Some critics argue that these early ideas were merely personal quirks, not universal truths. They point to Kierkegaard's broken engagement and Nietzsche's hearing loss as evidence that his thoughts were born out of personal tragedy rather than a broader insight. They ask, why should anyone care about a single pastor's heartbreak or a philosopher's deafness? In response, one can note that personal experiences often spark ideas that later become useful to many. The student's story shows that a single moment of doubt can echo in classrooms, workplaces, and homes. The traveler's storm shows that a single weather event can become a picture of how people face fear and hope. Another counterargument says that early existential ideas were too abstract for ordinary people. Critics claim that talking about subjectivity or the herd sounds like highbrow talk that does not help a farmer or a shopkeeper. To answer this, the script can return to the simple examples. When the student asks, "Or what if I choose a path that does not please my family?" the question is about real pressure many feel. When the traveler asks, "Should I risk the storm to reach my destination?" the question is about everyday risk. These are not abstract puzzles, they are lived moments. The language of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche can be turned into plain advice. Know your own heart, and do not hide behind what others say is right. Historical anecdotes help to ground the ideas. In 1841, Kierkegaard broke off his engagement with Regine Olsen, writing a long series of letters that later scholars called the Kierkegaard letters. He explained that his inner doubts made him feel he could not be a good husband. This personal drama gave him a deep sense of the pain that comes with freedom. He felt that each choice brings a cost, a feeling he would later describe as the anguish of choice. This story shows that his philosophy grew from a real-life event, not from a classroom lecture. In 1889, Nietzsche's hearing loss became almost total. He could no longer hear the sounds of the city, and he withdrew to a small house in Sils Maria, a quiet town by a lake. There he wrote, "I am a wandering spirit, a wandering thought." The loss of external noise forced him to listen to his inner voice, and he turned that silence into a powerful critique of society. His famous line, "God is dead," was not a joke about religion alone, but a statement about the loss of old guarantees that once gave people comfort. Without those guarantees, each person must create their own values. Both anecdotes illustrate how personal hardship can lead to ideas that speak to many. The broken engagement shows that love and commitment can become a source of inner conflict, while the loss of hearing shows that physical loss can sharpen mental focus. Both experiences fed into the larger theme of freedom. The freedom to choose even when the choice hurts, and the freedom to create meaning when old meanings disappear. The student's career decision can be compared to a garden. Each possible career is a seed. The student must plant one, water it, and watch it grow. Some seeds may not sprout, some may need more care, but the act of planting is itself a choice that gives life meaning. This garden analogy helps to picture how freedom works. Freedom is not just the ability to do anything. It is the ability to start something that reflects one's own values. Later, The video will discuss how this freedom can feel like a heavy load, a feeling philosophers call existential anxiety. The anxiety is not a bad thing. It is a sign that the person is aware of the weight of their own choices. The traveler's storm can be likened to a dark room with a single candle. The candle is the traveler's inner resolve. When the wind blows hard, the candle flickers, but it does not go out unless the traveler lets it. The storm tests the candle, just as anxiety tests a person's resolve. If the traveler protects the candle, the light stays on, and the traveler can find the way out of the storm. This picture shows how anxiety can be a tool, not just a threat. Kierkegaard's famous quote, "Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom," captures this idea. He wrote in his book, The Concept of Anxiety, that anxiety appears when a person sees many possibilities and feels the need to pick one. The student feels this when looking at the career list. The traveler feels it when seeing the storm. Both are standing at a crossroads, and the feeling that comes is not a flaw, but a sign of being alive. Nietzsche added another angle. He said, "Become who you are." This short line urges each person to shape themselves, not to follow the crowd. The traveler can become a brave explorer by facing the storm, not a timid shelter seeker. The student can become a creator by following a path that feels true, not a follower who chooses a safe but empty job. The phrase, "become who you are," is a call to act, to turn inner thoughts into outer actions. These early thinkers also warned about the danger of living without personal choice. Kierkegaard warned that people can fall into the aesthetic, a life of pleasure without deeper purpose. He wrote, "The aesthetic person lives for the moment, never looking beyond the next pleasure. This can be seen in a student who chooses a career only for money or fame, ignoring deeper interests. The result is a hollow feeling later in life." Nietzsche warned that the herd can crush individuality. He said, "Herd for herd forgets the individual and makes the individual forget the herd." In simple terms, if everyone follows the same path, the chance for new ideas shrinks. Both warnings point to the need for personal responsibility. The student must own the decision, even if it brings fear. The traveler must own the step into the storm, even if it brings danger. This responsibility is the core of what later sections will call freedom. Freedom is not the lack of rules, but the power to decide one's own rule. It is a heavy gift, and the heaviness is what creates anxiety. Critics who say the early ideas are too abstract can look at the plain language used by Kierkegaard and Nietzsche when they wrote letters to friends. In a letter to a friend, Kierkegaard wrote, "I cannot live without the feeling that I must choose." The sentence is short, clear, and speaks directly to the feeling of being forced to decide. Nietzsche, in a note to a colleague, wrote, "I have lost my hearing, but I hear my own thoughts louder than ever." Both statements use everyday words, showing that the core ideas can be expressed without complex jargon. The student's story also ties to a modern example of a young person choosing between a stable job in a big company and starting a small online business. The stable job offers security. The online business offers creativity. The anxiety of this choice feels like the storm, but the freedom to pick one path is the same as the early existential idea that each person must create their own meaning. In another modern case, a traveler decides whether to stay in a safe city or go to a remote village to help after a natural disaster. The decision brings risk, but also a sense of purpose that matches the old idea of becoming who you are. In both cases, the early ideas of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche still speak. They remind the listener that the feeling of being stuck, the feeling of anxiety, is not a sign of weakness, but a sign that one is aware of the power to choose. They also remind that personal hardship, like a broken engagement or a loss of hearing, can become a source of insight, not just pain. Later in the video, the discussion will move to how freedom can feel like a burden and how anxiety can be a guide. The student's career choice will be revisited when talking about authenticity, a word that means living in line with one's true self. The traveler's storm will be revisited when talking about the absurd, a term that describes the clash between the desire for meaning and the silence of the world. Both terms grow out of the early seeds planted by Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. To sum up the early roots, one can picture a garden of ideas. Kierkegaard planted the seed of personal choice and anxiety. Nietzsche watered the plant with the idea of creating one's own values and rejecting the herd. The broken engagement and the loss of hearing are the soil that gave the plant nutrients. The student and the story of freedom in existential thought begins with a simple idea. Human beings are free to choose, and they must own the results of those choices. This idea sits at the heart of existentialism. It is a claim that says each person carries the weight of their own actions. No one can hide behind fate, nature, or other people to avoid responsibility. The claim sounds easy, but it has deep roots and many twists. In the early part of the video, the roots of existentialism were traced back to thinkers who asked what it means to be a human being in a world that offers no clear guide. Those roots point to the work of Kierkegaard, who warned that a person must make a leap of faith, and to Nietzsche, who shouted that each person must create their own values. From those beginnings, the story moves to the mid-20th century, when two voices made the claim about freedom loud and clear. Those voices belong to Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. Sartre wrote that man is condemned to be free. The sentence is short, but it holds a big meaning. To be condemned means that there is no escape. Freedom is not a gift that can be taken away. It is a condition that each person lives with. Sartre believed that once a person is aware of this condition, the person must act as if every choice defines who they are. The person cannot say that they are only following a rule or a habit. The person must accept that each act is a statement of self. De Beauvoir added a similar voice. She wrote, "One is not born a woman, but becomes one." The quote shows how identity is not something fixed at birth. It is shaped by the choices a person makes and the ways society reacts to those choices. De Beauvoir used the idea of freedom to argue that each person can shape their own life, even when the world tries to push them into a set role. To see how this claim works in everyday life, imagine a teenager named Alex. Alex loves music, but also likes sports. One day, Alex must decide whether to join the school band or the basketball team. The decision feels simple, but it carries weight. If Alex joins the band, the teen will spend evenings practicing an instrument, meeting new friends, and maybe performing at school events. If Alex joins the basketball team, the teen will spend afternoons at the gym, learn to work in a fast-paced group, and maybe travel for games. In both cases, Alex is free to choose. Once the choice is made, Alex must own the result. If the teen later regrets the decision, that regret is part of the responsibility. The teen cannot blame the school, the parents, or the music teacher. The teen chose. A second example shows a shopper named Maya. Maya walks into a grocery store and sees two brands of cereal. One brand is cheap, but has little nutrition. The other brand costs more but contains whole grains and less sugar. Maya looks at the price, the label, and thinks about health. Maya decides to buy the healthier cereal. That choice is free. Maya cannot say that the cheaper brand forced the decision. Maya must own the result, whether the health benefits appear later or the budget feels tighter. The simple act of picking a cereal becomes a small test of freedom and responsibility. These stories illustrate the core claim. Freedom is not just a feeling. It is an active process. Responsibility follows each act. The claim also invites questions. Some people say that freedom is an illusion because genetics set limits. Others say that society shapes choices so strongly that true freedom cannot exist. These are the main counterarguments that will be examined. The first counterargument says that genetics limit freedom. The idea is that a person's brain chemistry, inherited traits, and even physical abilities shape what choices feel possible. For example, a person with a strong anxiety disorder may find it hard to choose a career that involves public speaking. The argument says that because the brain is wired in a certain way, the person does not have full freedom. The person is, in a sense, a product of biology. Sartre answered this line of thought by separating fact from value. He said that facts, such as a genetic condition, are given, but values, such as what to do about those facts, are always free. A person can accept a genetic limit, but the person must still decide how to live with it. The decision to seek therapy, to adapt a career, or to change habits is still a free act. Sartre wrote, "Freedom is what we do with what is given to us." The sentence shows that even when biology sets a stage, the actor on the stage can still choose the script. De Beauvoir offered a similar reply. She argued that oppression, whether it comes from biology or from social rules, does not erase freedom. She wrote that women have been told that their biology defines their role, but that claim is a social story, not a natural law. The story can be changed. In the same way, a person with a genetic condition can change the story about what that condition means. The person can still act, can still create meaning, and must still own the result. The second counterargument says that society forces choices. The claim is that culture, laws, media, and economic pressure push people towards certain paths. A teenager may feel pressure to join a popular sport because friends and parents expect it. A shopper may feel that the cheap cereal is the smart choice because of a sales sign. The argument says that these pressures reduce true freedom. Sartre answered by pointing to the concept of bad faith. Bad faith is when a person pretends that they have no choice and then hides behind the excuse of society. He said that when a person says, "Well, I had to do it because everyone does," the person is lying to themselves. The person still has the power to say no, even if it feels uncomfortable. The lie is not in the world. It is in the mind that refuses to see the choice. De Beauvoir added that social forces are often disguised as natural facts. She noted that the idea women belong in the home looks like a fact, but it is a story told by a society that wants to keep power. By recognizing the story, a person can choose to rewrite it. The rewrite is an act of freedom, even if the pressure remains. Both Sartre and de Beauvoir show that freedom is not a free ride. It is a heavy load. The load includes the need to look at facts, to see the pressure, and then to decide. The decision is always there, even if it feels small. Real-world applications of this idea appear in many fields. In education, teachers can give students choices about projects. The teacher can say, "You may write an essay or create a video." The student is free to pick and then must own the result. The teacher does not force a single method. In business, managers can let employees decide how to meet a goal. The employees are free to choose a plan and then must own the outcome. In politics, voters are free to pick a candidate and then must own the policies that follow. The existential claim reminds each of these arenas that freedom is always linked to responsibility. Modern interpretations of the claim keep the core idea but use new language. Some philosophers talk about agency, which means the ability to act. They say that agency is a skill that can be trained. Others use the term authenticity, which means living in a way that matches one's true self. Both ideas rest on the same belief, that each person can choose and must own the choice. In psychology, the concept of self-determination echoes the existential claim. It says that people thrive when they feel they are the authors of their own lives. To see how the claim works today, imagine a social media user named Leo. Leo scrolls through a feed and sees a post that says, "Buy this phone now, 20% off." Leo can click the link and buy the phone, or can close the page. The freedom is there. If Leo buys the phone, Leo must own the result. Maybe the phone is great, or maybe it breaks soon. If Leo does not buy, Leo must own the result. Perhaps the phone would have been useful, or perhaps it would have been a waste of money. The moment of clicking is a small but real test of freedom and responsibility. Another modern example involves a volunteer at a community garden. The volunteer can choose to water the plants every day or to skip a day. The garden will grow better if the volunteer keeps the promise. The volunteer must own the result of the choice, whether the plants thrive or wilt. The garden becomes a place where freedom and responsibility meet. A famous anecdote about Sartre helps to show how he lived his claim. In 1964, the Swedish Academy offered Sartre the Nobel Prize in Literature. Sartre wrote a letter saying, "Why decline the prize? Because I do not wish to be institutionalized." He refused the honor, saying that accepting it would make him a part of a system that could limit his freedom. The refusal is a clear act of freedom. Sartre chose to stay true to his belief, and he owned the result. He gave up a prestigious award and the attention that came with it. The story shows that even a great prize does not override the need to act freely. A second anecdote about de Beauvoir shows her sense of responsibility. During World War I, de Beauvoir worked as a nurse and a researcher in a French hospital. She helped treat wounded soldiers and also wrote about the experience. She chose to put herself into the war effort, even though she could have stayed safe. Her work was a choice that carried heavy responsibility. She owned the result, both the pain she saw and the stories she later told. The anecdote shows how freedom can be exercised in a time of crisis, and how responsibility follows. Both stories link back to the roots of existentialism. The early thinkers ask how a person can find meaning in a world without a set plan. Sartre and de Beauvoir answered by saying that each person must create meaning through free choice. The claim about freedom and responsibility is the bridge between the question of origins and the later question of meaning. After this segment, the video will move to the idea that meaning is not given, but made. The next part will explore how people build purpose when they accept that they are free and responsible. To sum up the core claim, the script repeats the simple line: humans are free to choose, and they must own the results. Sartre's man is condemned to be free, and de Beauvoir is not born a woman, but becomes one. Both stress that freedom is a condition, not a gift. The teen choosing a hobby, the shopper picking a brand, the volunteer caring for plants, and the nurse in wartime all show that freedom shows up in small acts and big acts alike. The counter-arguments about genetics and society remind the audience that freedom is never easy. Yet the replies from Sartre and de Beauvoir show that even when facts and pressures exist, the choice still belongs to the person. The script now invites the listener to think about their own choices. It asks what small decision today could be a test of freedom. It asks how the listener will own the result, even if it feels uncomfortable. The idea is that each moment is a chance to practice the existential claim. By seeing each moment as a chance, the listener can move from the roots of existential thought toward a life of meaning. The segment ends with a gentle reminder. Freedom is a quiet call that asks each person to act, to decide, to take the weight of the outcome. Responsibility is the echo that follows. The story of Sartre's Nobel refusal and de Beauvoir's wartime work shows that the call is real and the echo is loud. The next part will show how meaning can grow from this echo, how purpose can be built when freedom and responsibility are accepted. The journey continues, moving from the idea of freedom to the idea of meaning, and the listener is invited to walk that path, step by step. The scene begins on a grey morning when a commuter sits in a line of cars that stretches for blocks. The engine hums, the brake lights flash, and the driver glances at the clock. The world outside moves slow, while thoughts race inside. The commuter wonders why the day feels so long, why the work waiting at the office seems empty. In the same city, a child stands on a balcony, looking up at the bright blue sky. The child asks a parent, "Why is the sky blue?" The question feels simple, but it opens a door to a deeper feeling that many people know. A sense that life can seem pointless. That feeling is what Albert Camus called the absurd. Camus was born in French Algeria in 1913. He grew up in a place where the desert met the sea, where French culture mixed with Arab tradition. As a young man, he saw the clash of cultures, the harsh heat of the sun, and the quiet of the night. He wrote that the desert taught him to see the world without pretension. In his essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, he wrote, "The absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need for meaning and the silent, indifferent universe." He used the story of Sisyphus, a man forced to roll a stone up a hill only for it to fall back each time, as a picture of the human condition. Camus asked, "What must we do with a life that seems to have no built-in purpose?" One can picture the commuter in traffic as a modern Sisyphus. The car is the stone, the traffic light is the hill, and each time the light turns green the driver feels a brief lift, only to be stopped again by the next red. The commuter may feel that each stop is a reminder that there is no grand plan behind the jam. The child's question about the sky can feel like a tiny rebellion against the absurd. The child looks for a reason, a story, a purpose. The adult may answer with a simple fact about light scattering, but the child still feels the wonder of trying to understand. Camus did not say that the absurd means life is hopeless. He said it means that the search for meaning must be honest. He wrote, "There is no love of life without despair of life." The line shows that love and despair sit together. He believed that when a person accepts the absurd, they can still choose to live fully. He called this choice freedom. In his later work, The Rebel, he linked the absurd to the human drive to create values. The freedom to decide how to act, even when the world offers no answer, is at the heart of his thought. The play The Stranger was first performed in 1942, in the middle of World War I. The stage was dark, the audience quiet, and the actors spoke in a calm, detached tone. The main character, Meursault, does not show grief at his mother's death, and he does not fit the usual ideas of morality. The audience heard the war outside, heard the news of bombings, and still watched a man who seemed indifferent to everything. The performance reminded people that the war had made many feel the absurd. The play's success showed that the feeling of meaninglessness was not just a personal mood, but a shared experience of the time. Camus' time in Algeria also gave him a view of how daily life can hold meaning. He watched fishermen rise before dawn, mend nets, and share food with neighbors. He saw that these habits gave a sense of belonging, even if the larger world seemed empty. He wrote, "In the depth of winter, I finally learned that within me there lay an invincible summer." The line suggests that small daily acts can hold a quiet power. This observation forms a counterargument to the idea that the absurd is the only truth. One counterargument says that meaning is built in daily habits. A person may find purpose in cooking a meal, in teaching a child, in planting a garden. These acts do not need a grand cosmic plan. They are small, but they add up to a life that feels worthwhile. The commuter may think of the moment when a stranger smiles, when a radio song brings back a memory, when a coffee is shared with a friend. Those moments can be enough to feel that life matters. The argument says that the absurd is a modern myth, a story that grew when people lost the old rituals that once gave meaning, such as religious festivals or communal rites. Another counterargument says that the feeling of absurdity is a product of modern life, not a universal condition. In many cultures, people live with a sense of purpose tied to family, to land, to tradition. The idea that life is meaningless may be stronger in societies where technology and fast change break old bonds. The argument points to societies where people work together in fields, where stories are told at night, where each person knows their role. In those places, the absurd does not dominate the mind. The claim is that the absurd is a symptom of a particular historical moment, not a timeless fact. A real-world example of building meaning can be seen in a small bakery that opens every morning before sunrise. The baker kneads dough, watches the bread rise, and greets each customer by name. The baker does not think about the universe silence, but the routine gives a sense of purpose. Another example is a volunteer who helps clean a park each weekend. The act does not change the world, but it creates a small space of order in a chaotic city. Both examples show how daily habits can form a personal meaning that counters the absurd. Camus used an analogy of a sunrise to explain his idea. He said that the sun rises each day without asking why, and people can choose to watch it, to feel its warmth, or to ignore it. The sunrise does not offer a purpose, but it offers a chance to act. In the same way, a person can see the absurd and still decide to love, to create, to act. The commuter can decide to listen to a favorite song while stuck in traffic, to turn the idle time into a chance to plan a surprise for a friend. The child can decide to draw the sky, to imagine stories about clouds, even if the scientific answer is simple. A historical anecdote about Camus shows how he faced the absurd in his own life. In 1943, while living in occupied France, Camus was asked to write a piece for the Resistance newspaper. He wrote a short article that said, "The absurd man is he who knows that the world is silent, but still laughs." He risked his safety to share a message that life could still be lived with courage. The article was printed, and many readers found a spark of hope in the words. The anecdote shows that Camus believed that confronting the absurd could lead to action, not to surrender. Another anecdote comes from Camus' trip to the Algerian desert in 1946. He rode a camel across the dunes, felt the wind sweep away his thoughts, and wrote in his notebook, "In the desert, the silence is complete, but the heart still beats." He saw that even in a place where there is no noise, a person can feel a pulse of life. The desert scene became a picture of how the absurd can be met with a quiet resolve. The image stayed with him as he wrote about the human need to create meaning in a silent world. Camus' idea of freedom ties into the later discussion of authenticity. Authenticity means being true to one's own values, not simply following what society tells a person to do. When a person accepts the absurd, they can choose an authentic path. The commuter can decide to take a different route, to call a friend, to read a book, instead of simply waiting for the traffic to clear. The child can decide to draw a picture of the sky in bright colors, to ask more questions, to explore the world with curiosity. Both actions show that freedom is not just the lack of constraints, but the ability to decide what matters. A quote from Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus sums up the core idea. "One must imagine Sisyphus happy." The line tells the listener that happiness is not found in a grand plan, but in the way a person lives each moment. The image of Sisyphus smiling while pushing the stone suggests that the act itself can become a source of meaning. The commuter can smile at the radio, the child can laugh at a joke about clouds, and both can feel a small sense of purpose. In the discussion of absurdity, Camus also wrote, "The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. The words remind the effort, the striving can be enough, even if the final goal is unclear. The commuter's effort to stay calm, the child's effort to ask questions, are both struggles that fill the heart. When thinking about meaning, the idea that daily habits build purpose can be illustrated by a simple routine. A person wakes up, brushes teeth, makes coffee, reads a short article, and goes to work. Each step seems small, but together they create a pattern that gives a sense of order. The pattern can be a shield against the feeling that life is absurd. The pattern does not deny the silent universe, but it offers a way to live within it. The modern myth argument can be illustrated by looking at the rise of social media. Many people feel that scrolling through endless feeds makes life feel empty. Some say this feeling is a sign that the absurd is real. Others argue that the myth comes from overuse of screens, that real meaning is found when people put phones away and talk face to face. The debate shows that the sense of absurdity can be shaped by how people spend their time. Camus' own life shows a balance between confronting the absurd and building daily meaning. He wrote plays, essays, and novels. He worked as a journalist, raising his family and caring for his mother. He did not hide from the fact that the world can be harsh, but he also found joy in small moments, like sharing a glass of wine with friends. His life becomes a model of how one can accept the absurd and still make choices that feel real. The commuter, the child, the baker, the volunteer, the desert traveler, all of them illustrate the same point. Life can feel pointless when the big questions are asked. But meaning can grow in the small acts, in the choices made each day. Camus' message is not to deny the absurd, but to use it as a prompt to act. He says that when a person sees the world as silent, they can still create their own song. In the final view, absurdity and the search for meaning are not opposite forces. They are linked. The feeling that life is pointless can push a person to look for ways to fill the gap. The search for meaning can become a personal project, a set of habits, a series of choices. Camus' idea of freedom tells that each person can decide what matters, even if the universe does not give a direct answer. The commuter can decide that the traffic jam is a time to practice breathing. The child can decide that the sky is a canvas for imagination. Both choices turn the absurd into a space for living. Camus' words echo in modern thought. He wrote, "In the depth of winter, I finally learned that within me there lay an invincible summer. The line reminds that even when the world feels cold and empty, a warm inner life can survive. The commuter may feel the cold of a rainy morning, but a memory of a sunny picnic can bring heat. The child may feel the cold of a question with no clear answer, but the wonder of imagination can bring warmth." To close the segment, the narrator can picture the commuter finally reaching the office, the child finally drawing a picture of the blue sky, the baker pulling fresh bread from the oven, the volunteer seeing a clean park. Each of these scenes shows a person who faced the feeling of pointlessness and chose to act. The choice is the core of Camus' thought. The story of authenticity begins in the early 20th century, when a group of French thinkers started to ask what it means to be truly oneself. They were not looking for a set of rules or a moral code. Instead, they wanted to know how a person can live in a way that matches the inner sense of freedom. The word authenticity was taken from the Latin root that means "to be true." In the hands of Jean-Paul Sartre, it became a way to describe a life that does not hide behind excuses. Sartre first wrote about authenticity in his 1943 book Being and Nothingness. He called the opposite of authenticity bad faith. Bad faith is the act of pretending that one does not have a choice, even when the choice is clear. In simple terms, it is when a person tells themselves that they are forced by circumstances, while in fact they are still free to decide. Sartre summed it up with the line, "Man is condemned to be free." The word condemned does not mean punishment. It means that freedom is a fact that cannot be avoided. Because freedom is always there, Any attempt to hide from it is a lie to oneself. The idea of bad faith grew out of earlier ideas about freedom. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche had spoken about the will to power and the need to create one's own values. But it was Sartre who made the link between freedom and responsibility clear. He argued that each person must own the consequences of their choices. If a person pretends that they are only a cog in the machine, they are denying the fact that they can still act differently. This denial is what Sartre called bad faith. One classic example that Sartre used is the waiter who acts as if his role is only to serve. The waiter smiles, bows, and follows the script of a restaurant. He tells himself that he is just a waiter, that the job defines who he is. In reality, the waiter could have chosen to quit, to study, or to work somewhere else. By insisting that his identity is fixed, he is living in bad faith. He hides his freedom behind the uniform. A modern version of this story can be seen in a factory worker who pretends to love the job. The worker arrives early, puts on a bright smile, and tells friends that the work is great. Inside, the worker feels bored and trapped. He tells himself that the bills, the schedule, and the boss leave no room for change. Yet the worker still has the power to look for a new position, to ask for a different shift, or to learn a new skill. By saying, "I have no choice," the worker is slipping into bad faith. The mask of contentment hides the fact that freedom is still present. Another everyday case is a teenager who follows the latest fashion trend without thinking. The teen buys the newest shoes, copies the style of popular influencers, and claims that the trend is the only way to be accepted. The teen says, "If I don't wear these, I will be left out." In truth, the teen could choose a different style, could mix old clothes with new, or could simply ignore the trend. By pretending that the trend controls the teen is acting in bad faith. The teen hides the fact that personal taste can be chosen. These examples show how bad faith works in daily life. It is not a moral judgment that says a person is bad. It is a description of a mental habit that blocks true freedom. When a person pretends that they are only a role, a job, or a fashion follower, they are refusing to see the power they have to shape their own life. Sartre's ideas did not appear in a vacuum. They were shaped by lively debates in Paris cafes after World War I. One night, at the Café de Flore, Sartre and his friends sat at a small table, cigarette smoke curling above their heads. They argued about whether a person could ever be truly free in a world that seemed to demand conformity. Sartre claimed that freedom is always there, even if the world pushes against it. His friend Simone de Beauvoir, who would later write The Second Sex, replied that society often makes it hard for women to see their own freedom. Their conversation was recorded by a journalist who later wrote, "They spoke of masks and mirrors, of the ways people hide behind the roles given to them." De Beauvoir's own diary entries give a glimpse of how authenticity can be a struggle. In a 1945 entry she wrote, "I feel the weight of the expectations placed on a woman. I must smile. I must be gentle. I must accept the role of mother. Yet inside, I hear a voice that says I could be a writer, a thinker, a traveller." The clash between the two voices is a daily battle. Her words show that the pressure to conform can make authenticity feel like a luxury, something only a few can afford. Critics of Sartre's view argue that social pressure is not just a nuisance, but a necessary part of life. They say that humans are social animals who need rules, traditions, and shared goals. Without these, society would fall apart. From this angle, the idea that every person must constantly examine their own freedom can seem unrealistic. The critic might quote the sociologist Emile Durkheim, who wrote that social facts bind the individual. In this view, the pressure to fit in helps keep order and safety. A second counterargument claims that authenticity is a luxury only available to those who have basic needs met. A person who is hungry, sick, or living in war may not have the time or energy to question the meaning of their choices. For them, the immediate need to survive outweighs the philosophical quest for authenticity. This view is often expressed by feminist scholars who point out that poor women and people of color are forced to make choices under duress, and that calling them bad faith can be unfair. They might quote bell hooks, who wrote, "The struggle to survive does not leave room for the luxury of self-examination. Both criticisms have merit." They remind the audience that freedom is not a simple, isolated fact. Freedom is always mixed with responsibility, with social ties, and with material conditions. Sartre did not deny this. He wrote, "Man is free, but he is also condemned to be responsible for his freedom." He understood that the world can limit options, but he also believed that the mind can still choose how to respond to those limits. The concept of authenticity can be linked to the idea of the absurd, another theme in existential thought. The absurd is the feeling that life has no clear purpose, that the universe does not give a reason for human actions. Albert Camus, a contemporary of Sartre, described the absurd as the clash between the human desire for meaning and the silent world. When a person lives in bad faith, they add another layer of denial. They hide the absurd by pretending that they have no choice. By embracing authenticity, a person can face the absurd head-on, accepting that life has no preset script, yet still choosing how to act. Modern interpretations of authenticity often focus on digital life. Social media platforms let people present a curated version of themselves. A user may post pictures of travel, success, and happiness, while feeling empty inside. The online persona can become a mask that hides the real choices the person could make. Some psychologists call this self-presentation bias. In this setting, bad faith looks like scrolling through feeds, feeling that one must keep up with trends, and believing that the only way to be liked is to follow the algorithm. The same logic applies. The person pretends that the platform forces them, while they still have the power to post differently, to take a break, or to be honest about their feelings. Another modern example is the gig economy. A driver for a ride-sharing service may claim that the app forces them to work long hours to make ends meet. The driver says, "I have no choice. The app decides my schedule." Yet the driver could choose to log off, to seek other work, or to negotiate with the platform. By saying that the app controls everything, the driver may be slipping into bad faith. Recognizing the freedom to choose, even within constraints, can help the driver see that authenticity means aligning work with personal values, not just following a digital schedule. Analogies can help make the idea clearer. Imagine a person wearing a mask at a costume party. The mask hides the face, but the person can still decide whether to keep it on or to take it off. Bad faith is like refusing to take off the mask even when the party is over, pretending that the mask is the true self. Authenticity is the act of removing the mask when it no longer serves a purpose, and showing the real face, even if it feels vulnerable. A second analogy uses a river. A river flows whether people watch it or not. People can stand on the bank and watch, or they can jump in and swim. If a person says, "I cannot swim because the water is too cold," they are denying the fact that they could still choose to dress warmly, to take a short dip, or to find another way across. Bad faith is the refusal to see that the river still moves, and that the person still has a role in crossing it. Historical anecdotes add color to the discussion. In 1947, Sartre attended a debate at the Les Deux Magots Café, where he argued with a young communist about whether a worker could truly be free under capitalism. The communist insisted that the worker's choices were an illusion because the system owned the means of production. Sartre replied, "Even if the system is harsh, the worker can still choose how to think about it. The choice of attitude is always free. The audience laughed, but the point lingered. Freedom lives in the mind. Another story comes from de Beauvoir's time in the United States in the early 1950s. While visiting a women's college, she noticed that many students chose majors that were popular rather than those they loved. In a letter to a friend, she wrote, "They wear the dress of the major because it looks good on them, not because it feels right. The pressure to fit in is strong, but the heart still whispers what it wants." Her observation shows how social expectations can push people into bad faith, yet the inner voice of authenticity remains. The link between authenticity and freedom is not just a philosophical puzzle. It can affect everyday decisions. A person who chooses a career because it matches personal passions, even if it pays less, is acting authentically. A person who stays in a relationship because they feel they cannot be alone, even though they are unhappy, may be living in bad faith. Recognizing the gap between what feels forced and what is truly chosen can guide actions toward a more honest life. Practical steps can help people test whether they are in bad faith. One method is to ask, if I could choose any path, would I still pick this? If the answer is yes, the choice may be authentic. If the answer is no, the person may be hiding behind a role. Another method is to notice language that sounds like a rule. I have to. I must. It is what it is. Replacing those words with I can tell or I choose can shift the mindset toward freedom. The concept of authenticity also appears in contemporary art. A painter who creates work that reflects personal experience rather than what galleries demand is practicing authenticity. A musician who writes songs about personal struggle instead of copying popular trends is also being authentic. In both cases, the artist acknowledges the freedom to choose subject matter, even when market forces push for safe, profitable choices. In the field of education, teachers who design lessons based on student curiosity rather than strict curriculum mandates demonstrate authenticity. They recognize that they have the freedom to adapt, even when standards feel rigid. By doing so, they model for students how to live with choice, even in a system that often feels controlling. The discussion of authenticity also ties back to the earlier section on absurdity. When a person accepts that life existential anxiety is the feeling that rises when a person meets the unknown. It is the knot that forms when death and uncertainty press on the mind. The feeling is not just fear of a single event. It is a deeper sense that life can change at any moment. The feeling can be called angst in the language of philosophy. In this part of the story, the focus is on how that angst appears, why it matters, and how it can be used to find a true self. The first clear voice on this topic was Søren Kierkegaard. He wrote a book called Fear and Trembling. In it, he said that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. The quote reads, "Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom." By this, he meant that when a person sees many possible choices, the mind can spin. The spin is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign that the person is free to choose. Freedom brings the risk of choosing wrong. That risk makes the heart tremble. Kierkegaardian thought did not appear in a vacuum. The Christian tradition already spoke of sin and the fear of God. Kierkegaard took that fear and turned it toward the self. He asked what happens when a person looks at the empty space of the future. He asked what happens when the person knows that death will end every plan. He answered that the empty space creates a kind of anxiety that pushes the person to act. The story of Kierkegaard's public life helps to see why his ideas matter. In the 1840s, he entered a public debate with the Danish church. The church argued that faith could be taught by doctrine. Kierkegaard stood on a small stage in Copenhagen and shouted that faith is a personal leap, not a lecture. He said that each person must face the dread of the unknown alone. The crowd was shocked. Some laughed. Some laughed. Some left. The episode shows that the fear he described was not a quiet idea. It was a live storm in the public square. Another key voice on anxiety is Friedrich Nietzsche. He walked the high Alps in the summer of 18. He stayed in a small village called Sils Maria. While the wind blew over the peaks, he wrote about the need to become one's own master. He said, "He who has a why can bear any how." The line is not about a calm mind. It is about a mind that can turn anxiety into purpose. Nietzsche's mountain walks gave him a view of how small the world looks. The view helped him see that the fear of death is a part of life's climb. He wrote that the climb itself can be a source of meaning. Nietzsche's time on the mountain also gives an anecdote that fits the theme. One evening, after a storm, he sat by a fire with a friend. The friend asked why he seemed so calm after the thunder. Nietzsche answered that the thunder reminded him of the power that lies beyond human control. He said that the thunder is like anxiety. It shakes the soul, but it also tells the soul to stay awake. This story shows how anxiety can be a signal, not a flaw. Both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche agree that anxiety can push a person toward authenticity. Authenticity means living in a way that matches one's own values, not the values forced by society. When anxiety appears, it can act as a mirror. The mirror shows what the person hides behind. The person can then decide to drop the mask. To see how this works in daily life, imagine a parent who worries about a child's future. The parent thinks about school, health, jobs, and love. The worry is not about a single test. It is about the whole path that may never be known. The parent feels a tight knot in the chest. That knot is existential anxiety. The parent can let the knot push them to talk more, to teach better, to listen. The knot can also push the parent to ask, "What does a good life look like for my child?" The answer can be a personal guide, not a generic rule. A second everyday case is a student who fears exam results. The student studies hard, but the night before the test, the mind races. The mind asks, "What if I fail? What if I cannot get a job? What if my life ends up empty?" The fear is not just about a grade. It is about the unknown road after the exam. The anxiety can become a signal. The student can use the signal to ask, "What really matters to me? Is a grade the only path to meaning?" By answering, the student may find a purpose that is not tied to a single score. These two examples show how anxiety can be a useful guide. It points to the places where the person feels most vulnerable. It also points to the places where the person can grow. There are, however, voices that argue against this view. One argument says that anxiety is simply a health signal. It warns the body that something is wrong. In modern medicine, anxiety can be a sign of stress, hormone imbalance, or a mental illness that needs treatment. The argument says that when anxiety becomes chronic, it harms the heart, the mind, and the relationships. The best response is to treat it as a symptom, not a teacher. A second counter-argument comes from the practice of meditation. Many modern teachers claim that meditation can erase anxiety. They say that by focusing on the breath, the mind can quiet the storm. The claim is that the storm is an illusion created by thoughts. If the thoughts stop, the storm stops. This view treats anxiety as a mental habit that can be removed, not as a sign of freedom. Both counterarguments have value. The health view reminds that anxiety can become a disease. The meditation view reminds that the mind can learn to calm itself. Yet the existential view does not deny these points. It says that when anxiety is felt, the person can first notice the health warning, then calm the mind, and finally ask what the feeling is trying to show. The three steps can work together. Modern thinkers have taken this blend further. In the field of existential psychotherapy, therapists ask clients to name their anxiety, then to explore what choices the anxiety points to. One therapist writes, "When the client feels dread, the therapist invites the client to ask what freedom lies behind the dread. The method does not try to erase the dread. It tries to use it as a compass. The compass analogy helps to see the idea. Imagine a ship at sea with no stars. The ship feels a pull toward a dark spot. That pull is anxiety. The ship can ignore the pull and drift aimlessly, or the ship can turn toward the pull, use it to set a new course, and find a new land. The pull is not the destination, but it shows where the ship can go." Another analogy uses a storm. When a storm hits a house, the windows shake. The shaking is not the house falling. It is the wind testing the walls. The homeowner can repair the windows, but also can look at why the house was built in a place where storms come. The house can be moved, or the design can be changed. Anxiety works like the wind. It tests the walls of belief. Historical anecdotes add depth to the picture. In 1843, Kierkegaard wrote a pamphlet under the name Johannes de Silentio. He used the name to hide his identity because he feared the public would reject his ideas. He sent the pamphlet to a friend, hoping it would spark a private discussion. The friend replied with a letter that said, "Your fear of being heard shows that you already feel the anxiety you write about." This small exchange shows that even Kierkegaard felt the anxiety he described. A later anecdote involves Nietzsche's friend, the composer Richard Wagner. In 1869, Nietzsche visited Wagner in Bayreuth. They talked about art, power, and the meaning of life. During the talk, Wagner asked Nietzsche why he seemed so restless. Nietzsche answered that the restlessness was his own anxiety about the future of culture. He said that the anxiety made him write his music and his philosophy. The conversation ended with Wagner laughing, but the moment stayed in Nietzsche's mind as proof that anxiety can drive creation. These stories link back to authenticity. When a person feels anxiety, the feeling can push them to ask, "What do I truly want?" The question can lead to actions that match the inner self. The actions can be small, like a parent choosing to spend a quiet evening with a child, or large, like a writer drafting a new book. Existential anxiety also ties to the search for meaning. The search for meaning is the next part of the larger discussion. When anxiety shows up, it tells the person that the current path may lack meaning. The person can then look for a new path that feels real. This is why the section on authenticity and meaning follows naturally. To bring the ideas into the present, consider a modern workplace. An employee may fear losing the job due to automation. The fear is not just about the paycheck. It is about the loss of identity that the job gave. The employee feels anxiety in the night. If the employee listens, the anxiety may point to a hidden desire to learn new skills, to start a project, or to change career. The anxiety becomes a guide to a more authentic work life. Another modern scene is a person scrolling on social media and feeling empty. The person sees friends traveling, achieving, smiling. The scroll brings a knot of anxiety. The knot is not just about jealousy. It is about the sense that life is passing by without a clear purpose. The person can use the knot to ask, "What do I truly enjoy? What makes me feel alive?" The answer can lead to a new hobby, a volunteer job, or a deeper relationship. Both scenes show how existential anxiety works in everyday life. The feeling is a signal, not a curse. It can be a warning, a push, a compass. The view that meditation erases anxiety can be tested against these scenes. A person who meditates may feel the storm calm for a few minutes. The calm can give space to think. In that space, the person can ask the questions that anxiety raised. The meditation does not remove the storm forever, but it gives a pause. The pause can be used to turn the storm into a map. The health view also fits. If the anxiety becomes constant, it can hurt sleep, appetite, and heart health. The person should seek help, talk to a doctor, or practice healthy habits. Once the health threat is lowered, the person can return to the philosophical work of asking what the anxiety means. The combination of healthcare, meditation, and philosophical reflection creates a full approach. It respects the body, the mind, and the deeper self. Returning to the original thinkers, Kierkegaard wrote another line that fits the modern mix. Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. The line says that the past can help explain the feeling, but the person must act now. The line can be spoken in a calm voice, while a viewer thinks about their own anxiety. Nietzsche added a line from his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The story of existential thought often turns on the question of death. It is the moment when life meets its end, and that moment shapes how people choose to live. In this part of the video, the narrator will walk the listener through the way death appears in the work of Martin Heidegger and Albert Camus, and will show why that appearance matters for everyday choices. The scene opens with a simple image: a grandparent's birthday party. The kitchen smells of cake, children laugh, and a grandfather lifts his glass and looks at the faces around him. He feels the weight of years, the thin line between memory and forgetting. He knows that each birthday brings him a little closer to the day he will not be here. That knowledge makes the celebration feel richer, more real. It also makes him think about what he still wants to say, what he still wants to do. In a similar way, a pet's passing can turn an ordinary afternoon into a moment of deep reflection. A dog lies on the floor, breathing slow, eyes half closed. When the dog finally stops moving, the owner feels a sudden, sharp awareness that the world can end without warning. That awareness can push a person to cherish the small moments, to be kinder, to let go of petty worries. Both scenes show how death can act as a quiet teacher. Heidegger first wrote about death in his early work, Being and Time. He called the relationship between a person and death being toward the death. In simple words, this means that a person is always moving toward the end of life, even if the exact time is unknown. Heidegger wrote, "Lo, death is the possibility of the most authentic existence." By authentic, he meant a life that is true to one's own possibilities, not just a life shaped by others. Later in his career, Heidegger returned to this idea after World War. He saw the horror of war and the loss of many lives as a proof that death is not a distant fact, but a constant pressure that can sharpen our sense of self. He wrote, "Only when we take death seriously do we become free to choose our own path." This line links directly to the idea of freedom that appears in the earlier anxiety section of the series. Camus, writing after the war, took a different angle. In The Myth of Sisyphus, he said, "There is no love of life without the love of death." For Camus, the absurd world is one where no ultimate purpose is given. Yet a person can still find meaning by confronting the fact that life ends. He added, "The only way to deal with an unfree world is to become so absolutely free that your very existence is an act of rebellion." In this view, death is the final rebellion against the absurd. By accepting death, a person can live fully in the present, making each choice count. Camus' own life gave him a strong sense of this idea. During the German occupation of France, he joined the French resistance. He helped print underground newspapers, risked his life to spread truth, and wrote about the need to act despite the looming threat of death. His experience in the resistance showed how the awareness of death can push people to act with courage and honesty. Both thinkers agree that death is not just a biological event. They see it as a condition that shapes how people think about freedom, responsibility, and meaning. The link to anxiety is clear. When a person feels the pressure of death, a feeling of anxiety can arise. Heidegger called this weaving ahead of oneself. It is a feeling that pushes a person to look beyond everyday distractions. Camus described a similar feeling as the absurd shock that comes when one sees the gap between the desire for order and the chaotic reality of death. In both cases, the anxiety becomes a signal that invites the person to make authentic choices. To see how this works in real life, imagine a young doctor who has just finished a residency. The doctor remembers a patient who died suddenly, and the memory of that loss stays with her. She thinks about her own mortality and decides to spend more time with her family, to listen more carefully to patients, and to avoid a career that only seeks prestige. In another example, a writer hears about a friend's sudden death in a car accident. The writer feels a sharp reminder that time is limited, and decides to finish the novel that has been waiting on the shelf for years. Both stories show how the awareness of death can turn fear into motivation, shaping daily decisions. There are, however, strong counter-arguments. One common view says that death is simply a biological fact, nothing more. From this angle, thinking too much about death can distract people from living. The argument goes that if a person spends a lot of time worrying about the end, they may miss out on joy, relationships, and work. A second counter-argument says that focusing on death can actually harm life. It can lead to depression, to a sense that nothing matters, and to a withdrawal from social activity. Some psychologists warn that an obsessive focus on mortality can increase anxiety instead of reducing it. These points are worth hearing, because they remind the audience that any philosophy must be balanced with care. Heidegger's own life offers a historical anecdote that helps to weigh these arguments. In 1933, he accepted the position of rector at the University of Freiburg and joined the Nazi Party. He gave a speech that praised the new government, a choice that many scholars still debate. After the war, Heidegger was detained by the Allies and spent months under house arrest. During this time, he reflected on the role of death in his own choices. He wrote in his notebook, "The death of my own thought is the death of my freedom." This line shows how he linked his personal sense of failure to the larger idea that death can sharpen the need for authenticity. It also shows how the pressure of political death, being removed from a position, being judged, can force a thinker to reconsider his life. Camus' story provides another historical anecdote. In 1943, while working for the underground newspaper Combat, Camus was arrested by the Gestapo. He spent a night in a cell, hearing the distant sounds of bombs and the muffled cries of other prisoners. He later wrote, "I felt the breath of death on my neck, and yet I could not stop writing." That night, the fear of death made his words sharper, his resolve stronger. After the war, he returned to journalism and literature, always reminding readers that the presence of death should not stop action, but should push it. His experience in the resistance shows how death can be a catalyst for freedom and rebellion, not just a grim end. Modern interpretations of these ideas keep the core message alive. In today's world, many people practice war mortality awareness through activities such as writing a will, creating a bucket list, or visiting a hospice volunteer program. These practices are not about morbid fascination. They are about using the knowledge of death to clarify what matters most. Psychologists call this good-death reflection. Studies have shown that people who think about death in a balanced way tend to report higher life satisfaction because they focus on relationships, personal growth, and meaningful work. This modern trend echoes Heidegger's call to live authentically and Camus' call to rebel against absurdity. A simple analogy can help the listener picture the idea. Think of a candle in a dark room. The flame gives light and warmth, but the wind can blow it out at any moment. Knowing that the wind is always possible makes the candle's light seem more precious. The candle does not try to stop the wind, it simply shines brighter while it can. In the same way, the awareness of death can make a person's actions shine brighter. The candle does not become scared of the wind. It simply accepts that the wind may come and uses its light fully. Another analogy comes from a road trip. Imagine a driver who knows that the fuel gauge will eventually read empty. That knowledge does not stop the driver from enjoying the scenery, but it does make the driver plan stops, enjoy each mile, and avoid unnecessary detours. The driver's awareness of the end of the journey helps shape a better trip. In life, death is the final fuel gauge that helps people plan, prioritize, and savor each moment. The link to the earlier anxiety section is clear. When a person feels anxiety about death, that feeling can be a signal to examine what is truly important. Heidegger called this the call of death. It is not a scream, but a quiet reminder that time is limited. Camus described the feeling as the mob surge shock, a jolt that can either paralyze or push a person to act. In both cases, the anxiety becomes a tool for freedom. When the mind stops fearing the unknown, it can choose freely what to do next. To bring the ideas home, the narrator returns to the two everyday scenes introduced at the start. At the grandparent's birthday, the older person raises a glass and says, "I have lived many years, and I still have love to give." The words are simple, but they carry the weight of a life that knows its ending. The grandchildren listen, and the moment feels deeper because they sense that each year is a gift. In the pet's passing, the owner holds the animal's head, feels the soft fur, and whispers, "You taught me to love without fear." The loss becomes a reminder that love does not need a guarantee of forever. It only needs presence. Both scenes show how death, when faced calmly, can add meaning to ordinary moments. In closing, the narrator ties the ideas together. Death matters for how people live because it creates a boundary that makes choices clear. Heidegger's later work tells us that facing death opens the path to an authentic life, a life that is truly one's own. Camus shows that the awareness of death can become an act of rebellion, a way to live fully in a world without preset meaning. The counterarguments remind that too much focus can be harmful, so balance is needed. Historical anecdotes of Heidegger's post-war reflection and Camus' night in a Gestapo cell illustrate how real danger can sharpen thought. Modern practices of mortality awareness prove that the old ideas still help people today. The analogies of candle and road trip give a simple picture of how death can light up life. And the everyday scenes of a birthday and a pet's death bring the philosophy down to the kitchen table. The final thought is that death is not just an end, but a quiet partner that walks beside every living person. By listening to that partner, by feeling the anxiety it brings, and by choosing to act with freedom, each person can turn a simple birthday cake or a quiet goodbye into a moment of genuine meaning. This is the role of death in existential thought, and it is a role that continues to shape how people live today and tomorrow. Existentialism and ethics sit at the heart of a quiet but powerful conversation about how each person builds a moral life. The story begins in the early 20th century, when a group of thinkers asked a simple question. If there is no fixed human nature, how can a person decide what is right or wrong? Their answer was that choice itself creates the moral guide. The idea that existence precedes essence, first spoken by Jean-Paul Sartre, means that a person first appears in the world, then decides what to become. In this view, there is no pre-written script for moral action. The script of life is written step by step, each decision adding a line to the story of who one is. Sartre's claim that existence precedes essence is more than a clever phrase. It is a call to see each moment as an open field. When a driver sees a stranded car on a rainy highway, the driver faces a choice. The driver can pull over, help, and risk a delay, or keep driving and leave the other person alone. In the existential view, the driver's decision is the moment the driver defines a personal moral rule. If the driver helps, the driver creates a rule that caring for strangers matters. If the driver drives on, the driver creates a rule that self-preservation outweighs that care. The driver does not look for a universal law that says always help or will never help. Instead, the driver looks at the situation, feels the weight of freedom, and makes a choice that becomes part of the driver's own ethic. A second everyday scene shows the same pattern. A shopper stands in a coffee aisle and sees two brands. One is cheap. The other is labeled fair to trade. The shopper thinks about price, taste, and the story behind the beans. If the shopper chooses the fair trade coffee, the shopper is saying that supporting farmers' rights matters. If the shopper chooses the cheap brand, the shopper is saying that personal budget matters more. The choice builds a personal moral stance. In the existential sense, the shopper is not following a rule that fair is always right. The shopper is creating a rule for oneself through the act of choosing. The origins of this view stretch back to the 19th century, when philosophers like Sartre and Kierkegaard spoke of the new leap of faith that each individual must take. Kierkegaard warned that living by the crowd's expectations leads to a loss of self. He wrote, "Objectivity is truth, meaning that personal experience is the source of meaning." Later, Friedrich Nietzsche shouted that God is dead and that people must create their own values. Nietzsche's call to become who you are echoes the same idea that each person must shape a moral compass by personal action. These early voices set the stage for Sartre and his peers to claim that freedom is both a gift and a burden. Jean-Paul Sartre built his ethics on the idea of responsibility. He said, "Man is condemned to be free." The word condemned shows that freedom is not a light gift. It is a weight. When a person decides, the person also decides for all of humanity. Sartre argued that each choice shows what a person thinks every human should be like. If a driver helps a stranger, the driver is saying that humanity should care for each other. If the driver ignores the stranger, the driver is saying that humanity can look away. In this way, each act is a statement about the kind of world the chooser wants. Simone de Beauvoir took Sartre's ideas and turned them toward gender. She wrote, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." That line tells us that gender is not a fixed essence, but a set of choices and social expectations that each person can accept or reject. De Beauvoir's activism in the 1940s and 1950s showed how existential ethics can move from theory to action. She helped organize women's rights groups in Paris, and she argued that women must claim the freedom to decide their own lives. When she spoke at a rally in 1949, she told the crowd that each woman's decision to work, to study, or to stay at home creates a new moral picture for all women. Her words turned the abstract idea of choice into a concrete fight for equality. Albert Camus, though often linked to existentialism, called himself an absurdist. He still believed that personal choice matters. During the Algerian War in the 1950s, Camus wrote letters to the French government urging a humane end to the conflict. He said, "The only way to deal with an unjust world is to rebel." Camus' stance was not based on a universal law that all wars are wrong. Instead, it was based on his own sense of responsibility to act against suffering. He chose to speak out, even when many in his country stayed silent. His choice added a line to his personal moral story, and it gave others a model of how to act when faced with injustice. Existential ethics faces strong counter-arguments. One common claim is that without universal rules, society cannot hold people accountable. The argument says that if each person makes their own moral code, then there is no common ground to stop theft, murder, or fraud. The critic points to legal systems that rely on fixed laws. The critic asks, how can a driver be punished if helping a stranger is a personal choice? The existential answer is that society can still agree on basic rules, but those rules are not seen as absolute truths. They are agreements that people have chosen together. In this view, the driver's choice is still personal, but the driver also lives in a community that has collectively decided that certain actions, like harming others, are not allowed. A second counterargument says that relativism leads to chaos. If each person decides what is right, then moral chaos follows, and no one can trust anyone else. The argument points to history's darkest moments, where individuals claimed personal freedom to justify cruelty. The existential response is that true freedom always comes with responsibility. Sartre's "will condemn to be free" includes the idea that one cannot hide behind me choice to avoid blame. Each choice must be owned, and each owner must answer to others. The responsibility part of existential ethics means that personal freedom is bounded by the need to respect others' freedom. Real-world applications of existential ethics appear in many fields. In medicine, a doctor must decide whether to respect a patient's wish to refuse treatment. The doctor's choice reflects a personal moral stance about autonomy and the value of life. In business, a company leader may choose to pay workers a living wage even when cheaper labor is available. That leader's decision creates a personal ethical brand. In environmental activism, a person may decide to bike instead of drive, shaping a personal ethic of care for the planet. Each of these choices shows how existentialism turns everyday decisions into moral statements. Modern interpretations of existential ethics have spread into popular culture. Television shows often put characters in moral dilemmas that echo the driver and shopper scenes. In the series The Good Place, characters learn that their choices define their moral growth, not a set of external rules. Philosophers today write about ethical authenticity, a term that blends Sartre's idea of living true to one's self with the need to consider others. They argue that authenticity does not mean selfishness. It means owning one's choices and seeing how they affect the wider world. An analogy helps to picture this idea. Imagine a painter with a blank canvas. Each brushstroke adds color, shape, and meaning. The painter cannot look at a rule book that says all paintings must be blue. Instead, the painter decides what to paint, and each decision reveals the painter's own sense of beauty and purpose. In the same way, each moral decision is a brushstroke on the canvas of a life. The driver's help is a bright stroke of red. The driver's indifference is a darker stroke of grey. The canvas becomes a picture of who the driver is. A second analogy uses a garden. A gardener chooses which seeds to plant, how often to water, and which weeds to pull. The garden's appearance reflects those choices. If the gardener decides to plant native flowers, the garden supports local insects. If the gardener chooses exotic plants, the garden may harm the local ecosystem. The gardener's moral stance about caring for the environment is shown by each planting decision. This garden image matches the shopper's choice of fair-trade coffee, a small act that supports a larger ecosystem of fair labor. Historical anecdotes give depth to these ideas. One story tells of de Beauvoir's trip to the United Nations in 1946. She stood before the Assembly and argued that the Declaration of Human Rights must include women's rights. She said, "If we claim that all men are created equal, we must also claim that women are created equal." Her speech was a personal act of speaking truth, and it helped shape later international agreements. Another anecdote describes Camus' visit to a refugee camp in Algeria in 1957. He walked among families who had lost homes, and he wrote a letter describing their suffering. He refused to stay silent, even though many of his peers chose to ignore the conflict. His choice added a moral voice that resonated beyond the war. The link between responsibility and authenticity runs through all these stories. Responsibility, in existential terms, means that each person must own the consequences of their choices. Authenticity means that the choices come from a genuine inner conviction, not from social pressure. When the driver helps the stranded car, the driver feels the weight of responsibility for another's safety. The driver's action is authentic if it comes from a true desire to help, not from a desire to look good. When the shopper picks fair trade coffee, the shopper feels responsible for the lives of coffee growers. The shopper's choice is authentic if it reflects a real concern for fairness. Sartre's own words illustrate this link. He wrote, "Freedom is what you do with what has been done to you." The driver's freedom is not just the ability to move the car, but the ability to decide how to respond to another's need. The shopper's freedom is not just the ability to buy coffee, but the ability to decide which story to support. In both cases, the freedom to choose creates a personal moral code. Existential ethics also invites reflection on the limits of choice. Not all situations allow full freedom. A child in a war zone cannot choose whether to stay safe or to join a militia. Yet even in constrained settings, small choices matter. A child who shares a piece of bread with a sibling makes a moral statement about caring, even when larger forces dominate the scene. Existentialists say that even limited choices still reveal who a person is becoming. The idea that each choice is a moral act does not mean that all choices are equally weighty. Sartre distinguished between bad faith and good faith. Bad faith is when a person pretends that they have no choice or hides behind excuses. Good faith is when a person acknowledges the freedom and takes responsibility. When a driver pretends that the law forces them to keep driving, that is bad faith. When the driver admits that they could stop and still be safe, that is good faith. The driver's honesty about their freedom shapes the moral quality of the act. Critics who demand universal rules often point to the rule of do not kill. They argue that such a rule must exist for society to function. Existentialists respond that the rule itself is a product of collective choice, not a timeless command. The rule was created because people agreed that killing harms the community. The rule is still respected, but its origin lies in shared freedom, not in an external source. This view keeps space for personal moral growth while preserving social order. The fear that relativism leads to chaos can be eased by looking at how communities actually work. In Existentialism in Art and Literature is a story of how human beings look for meaning in a world that often feels empty. The idea first grew in philosophy, but it found a home in novels, plays, movies, and paintings. In those works, a person can see a lonely character, a strange scene, or a quiet moment, and feel the same questions inside. The art becomes a mirror that shows the viewer a piece of his own life. The mirror does not give a clear answer, but it lets the viewer sit with the question. The roots of this artistic turn go back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Thinkers such as Søren Kierkegaard and Friedrich Nietzsche wrote about the individual's struggle with freedom and purpose. Their words inspired writers who wanted to put those ideas into stories. Franz Kafka and Samuel Beckett are two of the most famous writers who turned existential thought into art. Their works still speak to readers and viewers today. Franz Kafka was born in Prague in 1883. He worked as a clerk in an insurance office, but at night he wrote stories that felt like a night walk through a dark city. In his famous novella, The Metamorphosis, a man wakes up as a giant insect. The story does not explain why the change happens. It simply shows how the man, Gregor Samsa, feels cut off from his family and from his own sense of self. A reader can sit with Gregor and feel the same weight of isolation. The story asks, without saying, what it means to be trapped in a body that no longer fits. A letter Kafka wrote to his father in 1919 gives a clear picture of his inner world. In the letter he writes, "You are a great man, and I am a child." He adds, "I am a cage, a prison, a tomb." The words show a deep sense of being trapped by expectations and by his own thoughts. The letter is not a philosophical treatise, but it carries the same feeling that appears in his fiction. When a reader sees those lines, the feeling of being stuck in a cage can echo the feeling in the Metamorphism. Samuel Beckett was an Irish writer who moved to Paris after World War II. He first performed a short play called The Expelled in a tiny theatre in Paris in 1945. The audience heard a man speak in broken sentences, trying to find a word that would fit his thought. The performance was rough, but it showed how language can fail when a person looks for meaning. Beckett's most famous play, Waiting for Godot, shows two characters, Vladimir and Estragon, waiting for someone who never arrives. The play repeats the same actions day after day. In one line they say, "Nothing to be done." The line is simple, but it carries the weight of a whole life spent waiting for purpose that may never come. Beckett also wrote in his play Endgame, "Nothing is certain but that we die." The line is short, but it tells the audience that death is the only thing we can be sure of. The audience feels the same certainty when they watch the characters stumble over small tasks. The play shows how ordinary actions can feel absurd when there is no clear goal. The absurd is a key idea in existentialism. It means that life can seem to have no purpose, but that does not stop a person from living. The arguments for seeing existential ideas in art are many. First, art can put abstract thoughts into concrete scenes. A reader can feel the weight of freedom when a character chooses a path that leads to loneliness. A viewer can see a quiet sunset over a city and feel the same emptiness that a philosopher describes. The visual or narrative detail makes the idea easier to feel. Second, art can let a person practice the act of confronting meaning. When a person reads a novel and sees a character wrestle with choice, the reader also wrestles with his own choices. The act of reading becomes a small rehearsal for living. There are also strong counter-arguments. One is that a piece of art can be enjoyed without any reference to philosophy. A person can love the mood of a painting, the humor of a comedy, or the suspense of a thriller without ever thinking about meaning or freedom. The pleasure can come from the story itself, from the colors, or from the rhythm of the language. The second counter-argument says that many creators do not set out to teach philosophy. Kafka wrote in a diary that he did not intend his stories to be lessons. Beckett said that he wrote because he needed to put words on a page, not to explain a theory. If the creator does not aim for a deep meaning, then any philosophical reading is just the audience's own addition. Both counter-arguments have merit, but they do not erase the link between existential ideas and art. Even if a creator does not plan a lesson, the work can still carry a feeling that matches the existential view. The feeling can be real for the audience. The audience may find a sense of comfort in knowing that others have felt the same emptiness. The audience may also find a spark that pushes them to ask new questions. Real-world applications of this link appear in everyday life. A student who reads The Metamorphosis may feel less alone when he faces pressure from family. He can see that feeling trapped is a common human experience. A moviegoer who watches a quiet scene in the film, lost in translation, may feel the same ache after a long day. In the film, a character looks out over a neon-lit Tokyo skyline at night. The camera stays still, and the sound fades. The viewer is left with a soft feeling of being small in a big world. The scene does not explain why the feeling exists, but it lets the viewer sit with it. The viewer may then think about his own life and ask if his work, his friends, or his love give him a sense of purpose. Lost in Translation, directed by Sofia Coppola, is a modern example of existential art. The film follows two strangers in a foreign city. They share quiet moments, drink coffee, and talk about being lost. In one line, the male lead says, "Well, the more you know who you are, the less you need to be anything else." The line is simple, but it points to the idea that identity can be found in being present, not in chasing a big plan. The audience can feel the same quiet after the film ends. The feeling can stay for days, like a soft echo. Paintings also show existential themes. Edward Hopper's Nighthawks shows a diner at night, with a few people sitting alone under bright light. The street outside is empty. The painting does not tell a story, but it shows a scene of quiet loneliness. A viewer can look at the painting and feel the same sense of being alone in a big city. The painting becomes a visual version of a novel about a lonely character. Another painting, Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night, shows a swirling sky over a small town. The sky feels alive, but the town below looks still. A viewer can sense a tension between chaos and calm, a feeling that matches the existential idea of searching for meaning in a moving world. Analogies can help explain how art works as a vessel for existential thought. Imagine a stone thrown into a pond. The stone is a story, a painting, or a film. The ripples are the thoughts that spread from the work into the mind of the viewer. Each ripple touches a different part of the shore, just as each person takes a different meaning from the same work. The stone does not decide where the ripples go, but the water carries them. In the same way, a writer may not decide what each reader feels, but the story carries the feeling of freedom, absurd, or loneliness to the reader. Historical anecdotes add depth to the picture. When Kafka wrote his letter to his father, he was at a time when he felt crushed by his family's expectations. He wrote the letter on a rainy night, using a thin pen that sometimes skipped. The letter was never sent, but the words survived in his diary. The act of writing the letter gave him a way to voice his inner cage. The anecdote shows how a personal act of writing can become a piece of art that later helps many people understand their own cages. Beckett's first performance in Paris was also a small, shaky event. He rented a tiny room above a bakery. The audience was made of a few friends and a couple of strangers who stopped by after buying bread. The performance was rough. Existentialism began as a call to look inside each person and ask what it means to be free, to choose, and to face the absurd. In earlier parts of the series, the narrator described the core idea that existence comes before any set definition, that each individual must create meaning in a world that offers none. Those ideas have inspired many readers, but they have also drawn sharp criticism from other philosophical camps. This segment turns to those critiques, focusing on two main sources of opposition: the analytic tradition, represented by Karl Popper, and the Marxist tradition, represented by Theodor Adorno. The goal is to show how the arguments work, how they meet existential claims, and how existentialism can still be useful even when those objections are taken seriously. Karl Popper, a leading figure in analytic philosophy, challenged existentialism on the grounds of clarity and scientific method. Popper's central demand was that a claim must be testable, that it must be possible to show it false. He wrote, "Science must be falsifiable. Otherwise, it is not science." From this point of view, the existential claim that life has no given meaning cannot be proved or disproved. Popper argued that such statements are not falsifiable, and therefore belong to a realm of metaphysics that offers no practical guidance. In a well-known exchange with Jean-Paul Sartre, Popper asked whether the claim, Existence precedes essence could be checked against any observation. Sartre replied that the claim is a description of the human condition, not a hypothesis about the world. Popper pressed further, noting that if a statement cannot be tested, it cannot help us separate truth from error. The debate highlighted a deep gap. Analytic philosophers look for precise, logical arguments, while existentialists accept that some truths live in lived experience, not in formal proof. Another line of critique comes from the Marxist side, especially through the work of Theodor Adorno. Adorno's concern was not about logical form, but about social context. In his lecture on culture, he warned that the culture industry turns art into a commodity, and existential talk becomes another product that comforts the individual while ignoring collective oppression. For Adorno, existentialism's focus on personal choice can distract people from the material forces that shape their lives. He argued that when people are told that they must create meaning on their own, they may feel responsible for conditions that are actually produced by economic systems. In this view, existentialism risks turning the struggle for social change into a private, inner quest, thereby weakening the power of collective action. The critique from Marxist thought can be illustrated with a historical anecdote. In the late 1960s, a group of factory workers in a German town organized a protest demanding better wages and safer conditions. Their leader, a young man named Hans, quoted Sartre in a speech, saying that each worker must choose his own path. The crowd, however, responded with anger, insisting that the real issue was the capitalist structure that forced them into dangerous work. The workers' demand for collective bargaining showed that they saw the problem as a social one, not a personal one. Adorno would point to this moment as proof that existential language can be misused to shift focus away from the need for collective solutions. A modern business example also shows how existential ideas can meet resistance. Maya Patel, the CEO of a fast-growing tech startup, was invited to a panel on finding purpose in the workplace. When the moderator asked her to speak about existential freedom, she replied, "My team does not need philosophy. They need clear goals, deadlines, and data. Talking about meaning distracts from the work we must do to stay competitive." Maya's stance reflects a common business attitude that values measurable outcomes over abstract reflection. In her view, existential talk is a luxury that does not help the company meet its targets. This attitude echoes Popper's demand for concrete criteria. If a concept cannot be turned into a metric, it is not useful for decision-making. These two examples, Hans the worker and Maya the CEO, show how existentialism can be seen as irrelevant or even harmful in certain contexts. The analytic critique says it lacks falsifiability. The Marxist critique says it overlooks structural forces. Both point to a limit. Existentialism may not give clear answers for policy, economics, or large-scale social planning. Yet the story does not end with dismissal. Several thinkers have offered counter-arguments that keep existential ideas alive in the public sphere. One counter-argument rests on the claim that existentialism's strength lies in personal growth, not in providing scientific laws. When a person faces a crisis, such as a career change, a health diagnosis, or the loss of a loved one, the existential invitation to confront freedom and responsibility can be a source of resilience. Psychologists have noted that patients who adopt an existential stance often report higher levels of meaning and lower levels of depression. In this sense, the lack of falsifiability is not a flaw, but a feature. The value is lived, not proved. The story of a single mother named Elena illustrates this point. After losing her job, Elena reads Sartre's essay on being and nothingness. She realized that she could no longer wait for a job to define her worth. She started a small home-based bakery, using the freedom to choose her own hours as a way to rebuild her identity. Elena's experience shows how existential ideas can translate into concrete action, even if the ideas themselves cannot be tested in a laboratory. Another counterargument emphasizes the possibility of blending existentialism with other philosophies. Some contemporary thinkers argue that existential themes can be combined with a Marxist analysis of power, creating a hybrid that respects both personal agency and social structure. This approach suggests that individuals can claim responsibility for their choices while also recognizing that those choices are shaped by economic conditions. A notable example is the work of feminist philosopher Iris Marion Young, who wrote about the politics of difference. She argued that oppression limits freedom, but that individuals still have the capacity to act within those limits. By linking existential freedom with a critique of material conditions, such a synthesis tries to answer both Popper's and Adorno's concerns. The video's earlier sections describe the idea of authenticity, the urge to act in line with one's true self. In the present critique, authenticity is examined from the outside. Popper would ask whether authenticity can be measured. Adorno would ask whether authenticity can be achieved without changing the social world. The narrator now brings those questions back to the viewer, reminding that the earlier discussion of angst and choice is not isolated. The criticism serves to sharpen the original ideas, just as a sculptor uses a chisel to refine a statue. By looking at the limits, the viewer can see where existentialism shines and where it needs support. Returning to the Popper-Sartre debate, a specific anecdote helps illustrate the tension. The debate took place at a conference in Zurich in 1955. Popper, known for his sharp wit, asked Sartre, "If existence precedes essence, what evidence do you have that a newborn infant is free to choose its essence?" Sartre answered, "The infant is not yet bound by any social role. It is a blank canvas upon which life paints." Popper replied, "But a canvas is still a piece of material. Its properties can be measured." The audience laughed, but the exchange left a mark. It showed that existentialists accept a kind of knowledge that comes from lived experience, while analytic philosophers look for empirical data. The story also shows why many students of philosophy remember this clash. It captures the core of the disagreement in a single, vivid moment. Adorno's lecture on culture, delivered in Frankfurt in 1963, provides a parallel anecdote. He stood before a crowd of students and said, "When a song is turned into a product, its power to awaken critical thought is dulled." He then quoted Heidegger, a fellow existential thinker, saying, "The essence of technology is not the tool, but the way it frames our thinking." Adorno used Heidegger's language to argue that existential ideas can be co-opted by the market, turning them into another form of cultural commodity. The lecture ended with a chorus of applause, but also with whispered concerns that the students might be missing the larger economic picture. This moment illustrates how Marxist critics see existentialism as vulnerable to being absorbed into the very system it tries to question. The critique from analytic philosophy also includes a more technical point about language. Popper argued that existentialists often use vague terms like freedom and meaning without defining them. In a paper on the philosophy of language, Popper wrote, "Without clear definitions, arguments become empty." He suggested that existentialists replace the freedom with the ability to act without external constraint, a definition that can be examined in real situations. Critics claim that by leaving terms open, existentialism invites anyone to project their own ideas onto it, which can lead to misuse. The business leader Maya Patel's reaction illustrates this risk. When a term is not clearly defined, managers may ignore it altogether, fearing it adds ambiguity to their plans. Marxist critics add a second technical objection. They say that existentialism, focus on the individual, can lead to a false consciousness, a term used by Marxist thinkers to describe a belief that one's personal choices are the main drivers of history, while ignoring class forces. Adorno warned, "When people think they are free because they can choose a brand of coffee, they miss the fact that the coffee is produced under exploitative labor." This criticism points to a danger. Existential talk may comfort people enough to stop questioning the larger system. In the community protest mentioned earlier, the workers who invoked Sartre's language were later reminded by a union organizer that real freedom we need is the freedom from exploitation. The organizer's comment reflects the Marxist view that personal freedom must be linked to collective emancipation. Despite these strong objections, many philosophers argue that existentialism still has a place in modern thought. One reason is its ability to speak to people who feel alienated by abstract systems. When a teenager feels lost in a world of social media and algorithmic feeds, the simple message that you can choose your own path can be a lifeline. The philosopher Thomas Nagel, though not an existentialist, has praised the movement for its honesty about human limits. He wrote, "Existentialism does not pretend to have all the answers. It merely names the questions that matter to us. This humility can be a bridge to other ideas because it invites dialogue rather than dogma." Another modern interpretation blends existentialism with neuroscience. Researchers studying the brain's reward system have found that people who feel they have agency show higher activity in the prefrontal cortex, a region linked to planning and self-control. This scientific finding can be read as a confirmation of the existential claim that acting as an authentic self has real effects on the mind. While Popper would still ask for falsifiable predictions, the data offers a way to connect lived experience with empirical study. In this sense, existentialism can evolve, meeting the analytic demand for evidence while keeping its core focus on personal meaning. The video also explored earlier the idea that existentialism emerged after World War III, a time when many felt that traditional moral systems had failed. The critiques from Popper and Adorno can be seen as part of that same historical moment. Popper, having survived the war, wanted a philosophy that could protect science from totalitarian misuse. Adorno, a member of the Frankfurt School, saw the rise of mass culture as a threat to critical thought. Both sought tools to guard against the kind of nihilism that existentialism seemed to embrace. By placing the critiques in their historical context, the narrator shows that the disagreement is not just abstract, but rooted in real events. In practice, the limits of existentialism become clear when policymakers try to use it as a guide for large-scale decisions. A city council debating how to allocate housing funds might hear an existential argument that each citizen must choose their own destiny. The council, however, must consider data on income, demographics, and supply. Here, the analytic demand for measurable outcomes wins out. The Marxist critique would add that the council must also address the power of landlords and developers, not just individual choices. The example demonstrates that existentialism can inspire personal reflection, but it does not replace the need for collective planning. Nevertheless, some social programs have taken inspiration from existential ideas while staying grounded in collective action. A community garden in Detroit, for instance, encourages residents to create meaning through planting. The garden provides a shared space where individuals can express themselves, yet it also addresses food deserts, a structural problem. The project shows how personal agency and social responsibility can coexist. By framing the garden as a place for authentic expression, the organizers tap into existential motivation, while the outcome is that the narrator of the video begins by reminding the listener that existential ideas are not locked away in dusty books. They can be used in a morning commute, in a kitchen at night, or in a garden on a sunny afternoon. The first practical step is a simple journal. Each day, the person writes down one choice that felt important. The entry can be as brief as a sentence. I chose to take the longer route to work because I wanted to see the river. By writing, the person makes the choice visible. The act of naming a decision brings a sense of ownership. In the journal, the person can also note how the choice felt. Was there a hint of anxiety? Was there a spark of excitement? This habit turns ordinary moments into chances to see freedom in action. The second step is mindful choice-making. When the person stands at a crossroads, whether literal or figurative, they pause for a breath. The pause is not a long meditation, just a moment to ask, what am I choosing right now? Why? This question does not need a deep answer in the moment. It only asks the mind to notice the act of choosing. For a commuter, the question might appear as the train doors close. The commuter can think, I am stepping onto this train because I need to be at the office, but I could also walk. That brief awareness makes the routine feel less automatic. It turns a habit into a small act of freedom. The third step is a short meditation that lasts 2 to 3 minutes. The person sits upright, closes the eyes, and focuses on the breath. When thoughts drift, the person gently brings the mind back, noting each thought as a passing cloud. This practice is not meant to empty the mind, but to watch thoughts without being swept away. Over time, the person learns that thoughts are not commands. The meditation builds a habit of stepping back from the rush of daily life, creating space to act authentically. An example of a commuter puts the steps together. Maya rides the subway each weekday. She keeps a small notebook in her bag. One morning, the train is delayed. Instead of scrolling on her phone, she writes, I chose to stay calm while waiting. She then pauses, breathes, and asks herself why she feels irritated. She notices that the irritation comes from a fear of being late, not from the delay itself. She breathes again, and the feeling eases. By the time the train moves, Maya feels that she has made a small, real choice about her mood. The commuter's story shows how a tiny habit can turn a stressful moment into a practice of freedom. A second example shows a parent at bedtime. Carlos reads a story to his daughter every night. One evening, the story feels familiar, and Carlos wonders whether to repeat it or try a new one. He opens his journal, writes, I am choosing a story that will spark curiosity. He pauses, breathes, and thinks, what does my daughter need right now? He decides to tell a tale about a garden that grows in a city. The choice feels intentional. The bedtime routine becomes a moment where the parent reflects on meaning for both child and self. The simple act of noting the decision makes the night feel richer. Some people argue that routines already work fine. They say that a commuter who simply catches the train does not need to stop and think. They claim that adding a journal or a pause will only waste time. This view holds that efficiency is the best goal. Yet the existential perspective asks whether efficiency alone gives a sense of purpose. When a person simply follows a schedule without noticing, the days can blend into a blur. The counterargument points out that the cost of a few minutes each day is small compared to the gain of feeling truly present. The practice does not replace the routine. It adds a layer of awareness. Another common objection is that philosophy feels heavy, like a weight that drags down the mind. Some think that words about authenticity and freedom belong in a lecture hall, not in a kitchen. This fear can stop a person from trying the steps. The response is that existential tools are meant to be light. They are like a pocket knife, small, simple, and useful. The journal is a pocket notebook. The pause is a breath. The meditation is a brief stretch. By keeping the tools tiny, the philosophy stays gentle. The feeling of heaviness often comes from trying to solve every problem at once. The practice invites the person to start with one small choice each day. A modern therapist named Dr. Elena Rivera uses these tools in her sessions. She works with clients who feel stuck in jobs they do not love. Dr. Rivera asks each client to keep a choice log for a week. The log records moments when the client could have acted differently, even in tiny ways. After a week, the therapist and client review the log together. They look for patterns of avoidance and moments of courage. Dr. Rivera reports that clients often feel a spark of agency after seeing their own freedom on paper. The therapist also teaches a brief breathing exercise before each session, so the client can enter the room with a calm mind. This anecdote shows that existential practice can fit into professional help, not just personal reflection. A community garden project in a downtown neighborhood illustrates existential ideas in a group setting. The garden began when a group of neighbors decided to turn an empty lot into a place to grow vegetables. They called the project Free Roots. Each participant chose a plot and a plant they felt drawn to. The act of choosing a plant became a symbol of personal freedom. The garden meetings started with a short moment of silence, where each person thought about why they wanted to grow that particular seed. Over time, the garden produced food, but also stories of how the simple act of planting helped people feel more authentic. The garden shows how a collective can practice freedom together, turning an abstract idea into a living space. The themes of meaning, freedom, and authenticity run through all these stories. Meaning appears when the person names a choice. Freedom appears when the person sees that a choice was possible. Authenticity appears when the person acts in line with an inner sense of what matters. The journal, the pause, and the short meditation are tools that help the person notice these three threads. When the person looks back at a day, they may see a pattern. A decision at the bus stop, a word spoken to a friend, a habit changed at dinner. Each thread can be pulled and examined, turning the ordinary into a field of possibility. A quote from Jean-Paul Sartre, a key thinker of existentialism, fits well here. He wrote, "Man is condemned to be free." In plain terms, this means that each person cannot escape the fact that they must choose. The word condemned sounds harsh, but the idea is simple. There is no excuse to hide behind fate. Another quote from Søren Kierkegaard, an earlier thinker, says, "Life can only be understood backward, but it must be lived forward." This reminds the listener that looking back at a journal helps make sense of choices, while the act of choosing must happen now. Both quotes are short, and the narrator repeats them in a calm voice, letting the meaning settle. An analogy helps to lock the idea in memory. Think of a road sign that appears at a fork. The sign does not force the driver to turn left or right, but it makes the driver aware of the options. The journal is like that sign, pointing out the choices that were there. The pause is like a car slowing down to read the sign. The brief meditation is like a moment when the driver steps out of the car, looks at the whole road, and feels the wind. The driver still decides which way to go, but the decision feels more real. This picture uses everyday travel to explain existential practice. A second analogy compares the mind to a garden. In a garden, each seed is a potential action. The gardener must decide which seeds to plant, water, and prune. The journal records which seeds were planted. The pause is the moment the gardener checks the soil. The short meditation is the quiet time spent watching the garden grow. When the gardener watches a seed sprout, they see the result of a choice. This analogy ties the community garden story to personal practice, showing that the same ideas work on a small scale and a large scale. A historical anecdote about Albert Camus, a writer often linked to existential thought, adds depth. Camus once walked along the beach in Algiers and watched fishermen pull in their nets. He noted how each fisherman chose to keep working despite the endless sea. Camus wrote that the act of continuing is a form of rebellion against meaninglessness. The story shows that even a simple daily task can become an act of freedom when the person notices it. Another anecdote comes from Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist who survived a concentration camp. He kept a notebook where he wrote about small choices he could still make, such as how to treat a fellow prisoner. Frankl later said that those tiny choices gave him a sense of purpose. Both stories illustrate that existential practice can survive in the harshest conditions, and that it can also thrive in everyday life. The practical steps can be summarized without a list. First, keep a small notebook and write one choice each day. Second, pause for a breath before a decision and ask what the choice is. Third, sit quietly for a few minutes, notice thoughts, and let them pass. Each step is short enough to fit into a busy schedule. The person does not need to change the whole day, only to add a tiny habit. Over weeks, the habits build a habit of noticing, which in turn builds a habit of acting with intention. Some viewers may wonder if these habits will feel forced. The answer lies in the word simple. The journal can be a pocket notepad, the pause can be a single inhale, the meditation can be a timer on a phone. The tools do not demand a change in external circumstances, only a shift in attention. When the person sees that the tools are easy, the feeling of heaviness fades. The practice becomes a gentle reminder, not a heavy load. The video also offers a short guided exercise. The narrator asks the listener to close their eyes, breathe in for 3 counts, breathe out for 3 counts, and repeat 3 times. Then the narrator says, "Now think of a small decision you made today. It could be the coffee you chose, the route you walked, or the word you said to a friend. Notice the feeling that came with that choice." The listener is invited to smile if the feeling was good, or to note a knot if it was not. This short practice shows how the 3 steps can be combined in a single moment. When the day ends, the person can look at the journal and see a pattern. The pattern may show that most choices were made out of habit, or that some choices sparked joy. By seeing the pattern, the person can decide to keep the habits that bring meaning and let go of those that do not. This reflection is the final piece of the practice. It turns daily life into a story the person writes with their own hand. The final part of the segment ties everything together. The narrator reminds the listener that meaning does not appear as a grand revelation, but as a collection of small moments where the person acted freely. Freedom is not the absence of rules, but the ability to choose within them. Authenticity is not a perfect self, but the willingness to act in line with what feels true in each moment. The journal, the pause, and the brief meditation are tools that help the person see these qualities. By using them, the person can turn a commuter ride, a bedtime story, a garden plot, or a therapy session into a space for growth. The video ends with a gentle quote from Camus. "In the depth of winter, I finally learned that within me there lay an invincible summer." The narrator explains that the invincible summer is the inner sense of freedom that can survive any routine or heavy thought. The viewer is invited to try one small step tomorrow, to write a line, to pause, or to breathe. The tone stays calm, the language stays simple, and the message stays clear. Existential ideas can live in everyday actions, and each small choice adds up to a life lived with meaning, freedom, and authenticity.